April 28, 1948, 14:30 hours. Soviet Military Administration Headquarters, Karlshorst, East Berlin. Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, Soviet commander of the Eastern Zone, received an encrypted telegram from Moscow that would test the resolve of the most powerful military forces on Earth. The message was brief but unequivocal. Implement the complete blockade of all land routes to West Berlin, effective immediately. As Sokolovsky read Stalin's orders, the sound of American C-47 transport planes rumbled overhead, their engines a constant reminder that 2 million West Berliners depended entirely on Western supply lines that Moscow was about to sever. What Stalin didn't anticipate was that one American general would refuse to abandon those civilians, even if it meant war with the Soviet Union. General Lucius Clay had arrived in Germany 3 years earlier as deputy military governor, tasked with the impossible mission of rebuilding a nation that had been reduced to rubble while managing an increasingly hostile relationship with Soviet forces. Clay was 51 years old, a Georgian by birth who had overseen massive construction projects during the Great Depression and had earned a reputation for getting impossible jobs done regardless of political obstacles. His weathered face bore the stress lines of a man who had spent the past 3 years navigating the treacherous waters of four-power occupation, watching as Stalin systematically violated every agreement made at Yalta and Potsdam. The smell of reconstruction dust and cigarette smoke perpetually clung to his olive-drab uniform as he moved through the bombed-out streets of Berlin, where children still played among the rubble and families lived in basements because entire city blocks had been reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted steel and shattered concrete. The crisis began not with military action, but with bureaucratic harassment that escalated systematically throughout the spring of 1948. Soviet authorities started by demanding additional paperwork for supply trains crossing the Eastern Zone, then requiring inspections that stretched for hours in the cold morning air while perishable goods spoiled in unheated railway cars. By early June, they had restricted traffic to a single rail line and highway, forcing thousands of tons of daily supplies through bottlenecks that created shortages of everything from coal to medical supplies in West Berlin. Clay watched these incremental restrictions with growing alarm, recognizing Stalin's strategy of applying pressure gradually to avoid triggering a decisive Western response while slowly strangling the city's 2 million inhabitants. Intelligence reports crossing his desk described Soviet tank movements near the sector boundaries, massive troop buildups in the Eastern Zone, and increasingly aggressive rhetoric from Moscow about eliminating the Western presence in Berlin entirely. The final provocation came on June 24, 1948, when Soviet guards halted all rail traffic at the Marienborn checkpoint, citing technical difficulties with railway equipment that somehow required indefinite repairs. Within hours, similar technical problems appeared at every crossing point between the Western occupation zones and Berlin, creating a complete land blockade of the former German capital. Clay received the news while reviewing supply manifests in his office at the IG Farben building in Frankfurt, the acrid smell of carbon paper and mimeograph ink filling the air as staff officers rushed in with increasingly dire reports. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. West Berlin consumed 400 or 500 tons of food, coal, and medical supplies daily, with existing stockpiles sufficient for perhaps 36 days if rationing began immediately. Stalin had calculated that the Western powers would face an impossible choice between abandoning Berlin or risking global war over a city surrounded by Soviet forces. Clay's initial response defied conventional military wisdom and political calculation. Rather than seeking authorization from Washington or consulting with British and French counterparts, he immediately called Colonel Frank Hawley, the American commandant in Berlin, and delivered orders that would echo through Cold War history. Prepare for an indefinite airlift operation to supply the entire city by air. Hawley's stunned silence lasted nearly 30 seconds before he asked about aircraft availability, runway capacity, and cargo tonnage calculations that made the operation appear impossible. Berlin's airports could handle perhaps 150 tons of cargo daily under optimal conditions, less than 4% of the city's minimum requirements. Clay's response was characteristically blunt. "We'll figure out how to make it work. We're not abandoning 2 million people because Stalin thinks we'll blink first. If you want to discover how a Georgia-born engineer outsmarted the master of Soviet strategy and saved an entire city from starvation, please like this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories from the archives. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next episodes. The airlift began with 12 C-47 Skytrain aircraft operating from Rhein-Main Air Base near Frankfurt, their twin-engine drone filling the summer sky as they traced the narrow air corridor to Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. Each plane carried 3 tons of cargo maximum, mostly coal and flour packed in heavy canvas bags that left crews covered in black dust and white powder by the end of each flight. Clay personally supervised the first days of operation, standing on the Tempelhof tarmac in the humid Berlin morning, watching pilots unload supplies while Soviet fighter planes circled at the edges of the Western air corridors. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with coal dust and sweat created a distinctive odor that would become synonymous with Operation Vittles, as American air crews dubbed the mission. Clay's hands, permanently stained with ink from constantly reviewing cargo manifests and flight schedules, traced calculations on yellow legal pads that showed the operation falling short by thousands of tons daily. The breakthrough came when Clay realized the problem wasn't aircraft capacity, but turnaround time and operational efficiency. Working 18-hour days, he implemented a revolutionary system of continuous operations that treated the airlift like a massive conveyor belt rather than individual flights. Aircraft landed at Tempelhof every 3 minutes during peak hours, their engines still running, while German workers unloaded cargo with mechanical precision that reduced ground time to 30 minutes or less. Clay personally timed each operation with a stopwatch, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies while standing in the noise and diesel exhaust of constant aircraft operations. Pilots reported seeing his distinctive figure at all hours, sometimes directing traffic in the pre-dawn darkness, other times reviewing maintenance schedules by flashlight while ground crews worked through the night. Military records from the Joint Chiefs of Staff show increasing pressure on Clay to abandon the airlift as Soviet harassment escalated throughout July 1948. Marshal Sokolovsky ordered fighter planes to conduct training exercises in the air corridors, forcing cargo aircraft to take evasive action while carrying maximum loads of coal and food. Soviet searchlights illuminated night flights with blinding intensity, creating dangerous visual conditions for pilots already operating on minimal sleep. Ground-based radio transmitters broadcast interference on Allied frequencies, forcing air traffic controllers to shout instructions over static, and jamming that made instrument approaches treacherous in bad weather. Clay's response to each escalation was to increase flight frequency rather than reduce operations, adding night flights and weekend schedules that pushed aircraft and crews beyond normal operational limits. The personal confrontation between Clay and Stalin occurred through diplomatic channels, but carried the weight of direct military threat. Soviet representatives in Berlin demanded meetings with Clay, ostensibly to discuss technical details of the blockade, but actually to gauge American resolve and identify pressure points. During one such meeting in late July, Clay was informed that Moscow viewed the airlift as a provocative military operation that could not continue indefinitely. When pressed to establish a timeline for withdrawal from Berlin, Clay delivered the response that would define American Cold War strategy. "You can stop the airlift by shooting down our aircraft, but that means war. If you want war, you'll have to start it, because we're not leaving Berlin voluntarily. And if you try to force us out through starvation, you'll have to kill me first, because I'll be on the last plane out." How many of you have a grandfather, father, or uncle who served during the Cold War and never talked about how close the world came to nuclear conflict? These stories are disappearing from memory. Leave a comment right now saying just, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family. You're preserving the memory of how ordinary people prevented global catastrophe. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. Stalin's reaction to Clay's defiance came through intelligence channels that revealed the Soviet leader's private frustration and strategic miscalculation. Intercepted communications between Moscow and Berlin showed Stalin expressing disbelief that the Americans would risk global war over what he considered a peripheral political position. KGB reports from this period describe Stalin pacing his Kremlin office late into the night, chain-smoking and reviewing military assessments that showed American nuclear capability far exceeding Soviet capacity in 1948. The airlift had exposed a fundamental weakness in Soviet strategy. Stalin could threaten conventional war in Europe, but the United States possessed the atomic bomb while Soviet nuclear weapons remained theoretical. Clay's willingness to call Stalin's bluff forced the Soviet leader to confront the possibility that his blockade might trigger the very war he sought to avoid. The airlift's success exceeded every projection and prediction, transforming from emergency operation to sustained logistical triumph that redefined the possible in military aviation. By September 1948, Allied aircraft were delivering more supplies to Berlin by air than the city had received by land before the blockade, with over 500 tons daily, compared to the pre-blockade average of 800 tons by rail and truck. Clay had implemented innovations that included specialized aircraft for different cargo types, weather operations that continued in conditions previously considered impossible, and maintenance procedures that kept aging aircraft operational far beyond normal service intervals. German workers at Tempelhof Airport became so efficient that they could unload a C-54 Skymaster in 12 minutes, with coal bags moving from aircraft to trucks in a human chain that operated like clockwork throughout 12-hour shifts. The psychological impact on Berlin's population proved as important as the material supplies delivered by the constant stream of cargo aircraft. Clay understood that the airlift's success depended not only on tonnage delivered, but on civilian morale in the face of Soviet pressure and propaganda that predicted Western abandonment. He authorized flights carrying Christmas gifts for children, medical supplies for hospitals, and even live cattle for fresh milk. Operations that had minimal strategic value but enormous psychological impact. Intelligence reports from the period describe crowds of Berliners gathering at Tempelhof to watch aircraft arrivals, with children learning to identify different aircraft types by sound and families timing their daily activities around the 3-minute landing schedule that provided constant proof of American commitment. Soviet attempts to disrupt the airlift became increasingly desperate and dangerous as Clay's operation proved Stalin's calculations completely wrong. Fighter planes began buzzing cargo aircraft more aggressively, coming within feet of transport planes carrying maximum loads of coal and food. Ground-based searchlights targeted pilots during critical approach phases, creating temporary blindness that forced instruments-only landings in weather conditions that already strained safety margins. Radio jamming intensified to include false air traffic control instructions designed to cause crashes, forcing Allied controllers to develop authentication procedures that added complexity to already overcrowded radio frequencies. Clay's response was to document every incident meticulously while maintaining operations, creating a paper trail that demonstrated Soviet responsibility for any accidents, while refusing to provide justification for abandoning the airlift. The climactic moment came in late September, when Soviet forces positioned anti-aircraft batteries around Berlin's air corridors, creating the possibility of accidentally or intentionally shooting down Allied cargo planes. Intelligence estimates suggested that Stalin was considering military action to end the airlift, with tank divisions positioned for rapid movement toward the city if Western forces showed signs of withdrawal. Clay's response demonstrated the calculated risk-taking that had characterized his entire career. He ordered additional flights using military transport aircraft rather than civilian contractors, making any Soviet attack an unmistakable act of war against the United States Air Force. His personal message to Washington was characteristically direct. If they shoot down our planes, we respond with everything we have. If they don't, we keep flying until they lift the blockade. The turning point came not through direct confrontation, but through Soviet recognition that the blockade had failed strategically and politically. Intelligence reports from October 1948 show Kremlin discussions acknowledging that the airlift had transformed Berlin from a liability into a symbol of Western determination, with global opinion turning against Soviet tactics that appeared to target civilian populations. Stalin's inner circle reported that continuing the blockade risked pushing Western European nations toward permanent military alliance with the United States, the opposite of Soviet strategic objectives. Most critically, the airlift had proven American willingness to sustain long-term commitment to European security, dispelling Soviet assumptions about American isolationist tendencies and short attention span for overseas commitments. The blockade's end came through gradual de-escalation rather than dramatic announcement, with Soviet authorities quietly reducing restrictions on ground transport while maintaining face-saving rhetoric about technical repairs and administrative procedures. By May 1949, rail and highway traffic had resumed normal operations, though the airlift continued for several additional months to build stockpiles that would prevent future leverage attempts. Clay's final statistics showed over 277 000 flights delivering 3 million tons of supplies, with accident rates lower than normal peacetime operations despite constant Soviet harassment and marginal weather conditions. The human cost included 31 Allied aircrew deaths, mostly from accidents in bad weather, but not a single aircraft lost to enemy action despite constant provocation and the presence of Soviet fighters throughout the air corridors. Stalin's personal assessment of the crisis, revealed through post-Cold War archival research, showed his recognition that Clay had outmaneuvered Soviet strategy through superior logistics, unshakable determination, and accurate assessment of American public opinion. Kremlin documents describe Stalin's private admission that he had underestimated both American technological capability and political will to sustain long-term commitment to allies. The blockade had intended to demonstrate Western weakness and division, but instead proved American strength and unity, while creating the political justification for NATO and permanent American military presence in Europe that continues today. Clay's willingness to risk war rather than abandon Berlin had forced Stalin to back down from what Soviet leaders had considered a guaranteed victory. Clay returned to the United States in May 1949 to a hero's welcome that included ticker-tape parades and congressional testimony, but his personal satisfaction came from letters received from Berlin families who credited the airlift with saving their lives and preserving their freedom. He kept a folder of handwritten notes from German children thanking American pilots, including drawings of cargo planes and requests for chocolate and chewing gum that had been included in supply drops throughout the crisis. His post-war career included corporate leadership and public service, but Clay always considered the Berlin airlift his greatest professional achievement, proof that determination and logistical excellence could overcome seemingly impossible odds when moral clarity provided motivation. The aircraft and infrastructure that sustained the airlift became symbols of American technological capability and strategic vision that influenced Cold War competition for decades. Tempelhof Airport remained a symbol of Western commitment to Berlin until its closure in 2008, with many of the runways and buildings preserved as historical monuments. The C-54 Skymaster and C-47 Skytrain aircraft that carried the bulk of airlift cargo became icons of American aviation, with several restored examples now displayed in museums worldwide. NATO's standardized logistics procedures trace their origins to innovations developed during the Berlin crisis, when Clay's staff created interoperability standards that allowed American, British, and French aircraft to operate seamlessly from shared facilities. The broader lesson of Clay's confrontation with Stalin extends beyond military history to questions of leadership under extreme pressure and the importance of moral clarity in strategic decision-making. Clay understood that backing down from Berlin would signal American weakness throughout Europe and encourage further Soviet aggression, making short-term concessions counterproductive for long-term peace. His willingness to risk everything for principles rather than calculate political advantage demonstrated leadership that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal safety or career advancement. The airlift proved that technical innovation, logistical excellence, and unwavering determination could overcome even the most disadvantageous strategic positions when defending essential values. Modern analysis of the Berlin crisis shows Clay's strategy as a masterclass in calculated risk-taking that achieved maximum political objectives with minimum escalation. By refusing to be intimidated while avoiding provocative military action, he forced Stalin to choose between war and retreat, correctly calculating that Soviet nuclear inferiority made war an unacceptable risk for Moscow. The airlift's success established principles of crisis management that influence American foreign policy decisions today, proving that sustained commitment and technological superiority can overcome apparent tactical disadvantages. Clay's legacy demonstrates that sometimes the most important victories come not from battlefield combat, but from the willingness to outlast opponents through superior logistics and unshakable resolve. If this story inspired you the same way it inspired us, please do us a favor. Leave a like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about generals who refused to back down, airmen who risked everything for strangers, engineers who solved impossible problems under impossible pressure. Real people, real courage. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States? Germany? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served during the Cold War. Just let us know you're here. Thanks for watching, and thanks for ensuring that General Lucius Clay doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Note, this content combines historical education with entertainment elements for engaging storytelling purposes. The human dimension of the airlift revealed itself most powerfully in the personal stories of individual air crews who flew multiple missions daily through increasingly dangerous conditions, their faces etched with exhaustion as they navigated Soviet harassment while carrying the hopes of an entire city. Captain Gail Halverson, flying C-54 missions from Rhine, Maine, began dropping candy attached to handkerchief parachutes for children waiting at Tempelhof's fence line, an unauthorized action that grew into Operation Little Vittles when Clay personally approved candy drops that boosted civilian morale throughout the crisis. Halverson's aircraft logbooks show entries describing children's faces pressed against chain-link fencing, their eyes tracking each incoming aircraft with desperate hope that mixed with genuine excitement when small parachutes appeared in the sky carrying Hershey bars and chewing gum donated by American families who had heard about Berlin's children through radio broadcasts and newspaper reports. The technical challenges of sustaining round-the-clock operations in all weather conditions pushed both equipment and personnel beyond normal limits, creating innovations that influenced military aviation for decades afterward. Clay personally observed maintenance crews working through Berlin's harsh winter nights, their hands numb from cold as they performed engine changes and structural repairs on aircraft that were accumulating flight hours at rates that manufacturer specifications had never anticipated. The smell of hydraulic fluid and engine oil mixed with coffee and cigarette smoke as mechanics developed field-expedient repair techniques that kept aging C-47 aircraft operational when spare part shortages threatened to ground entire squadrons. Weather officers learned to make landing decisions based on ceiling and visibility measurements that civilian aviation would have considered impossible, while pilots developed instrument approach techniques that pushed safety margins to their absolute limits. Intelligence reports from this period reveal the extent of Soviet psychological warfare designed to break Western resolve through constant pressure short of direct military action. KGB operatives in Berlin spread rumors about American plans to abandon the city during winter months, when heating fuel shortages would make civilian suffering unbearable and politically costly for Western governments. Soviet radio broadcasts in German promised increased food rations and heating coal for families who demonstrated against the Western occupation while threatening retaliation against those who cooperated with Allied authorities. Clay countered this propaganda war by ensuring that airlift supplies included small luxuries that demonstrated American abundance and technological capability, such as fresh vegetables flown in from France and medical equipment that Berlin's hospitals had not seen since before the war began. The diplomatic maneuvering behind the scenes shows Clay operating with minimal direction from Washington, where President Truman faced enormous political pressure to avoid actions that might trigger global war less than 3 years after the atomic bombing of Japan had ended the previous conflict. State Department cables from this period express concern about Clay's aggressive stance and unauthorized commitments that exceeded his formal authority as military governor, with Secretary of State George Marshall privately questioning whether one general should be making decisions that could determine global peace or war. Clay's responses to Washington consistently emphasized that retreat from Berlin would signal American weakness throughout Europe and encourage Soviet expansion westward, making compromise impossible without destroying American credibility with emerging NATO allies. The airlift success created unexpected diplomatic leverage that shifted the balance of Cold War competition decisively in America's favor, demonstrating technological and logistical capabilities that Soviet leaders had not anticipated from a nation they considered politically divided and militarily inexperienced in European affairs. Stalin's private communications with Eastern European leaders, revealed through post-Cold War archival research, show his growing concern about American commitment to European defense and recognition that Soviet conventional military superiority might be offset by American technological innovation and industrial capacity. The constant stream of cargo aircraft over Berlin provided daily proof of American capability to sustain long-distance operations indefinitely, a demonstration that influenced Soviet strategic planning for the next 4 decades of Cold War competition. The winter months tested every assumption about the operation's feasibility. As November through February, weather created flying conditions that grounded civilian aviation throughout Europe, while Clay insisted that airlift operations continue without interruption. Pilots reported ice formation on aircraft wings that required constant de-icing procedures during flight, while visibility conditions at Berlin airports often dropped below minimums that would have prevented commercial operations. The smell of anti-icing fluid and exhaust from ground heating equipment filled the air as crews worked through sub-zero temperatures to maintain aircraft that were never designed for such intensive operations in harsh weather conditions. Clay's personal inspection tours during these months showed him walking Tempelhof's runways and driving snow, checking ice removal procedures, and consulting with meteorologists about window breaks in storm systems that might allow continued operations. Soviet countermeasures during the winter phase included jamming navigation beacons that guided aircraft through cloud layers, forcing pilots to rely on dead reckoning and radio direction finding techniques that increased the likelihood of accidents in bad weather. Ground-based radar installations around Berlin tracked every Allied flight and transmitted false course corrections designed to cause aircraft to deviate from approved air corridors, potentially providing justification for Soviet fighter interception. Clay's response was to install additional navigation equipment and develop backup communication procedures that ensured flight safety while documenting Soviet interference for later diplomatic protest. His personal flying time during this period included observation flights in weather conditions that tested his own courage, as he insisted on personally verifying that operations he ordered others to conduct were actually feasible under combat conditions. The economic impact of the airlift extended far beyond Berlin to influence reconstruction efforts throughout Western Europe, as American logistical success demonstrated industrial capacity that reassured allies about long-term commitment to European recovery and defense. Marshall Plan administrators noted increased confidence among European governments about American reliability, with requests for reconstruction aid increasing dramatically after the airlift proved American willingness to sustain expensive operations for political rather than economic reasons. British Foreign Office reports from this period describe Clay's operation as more valuable than military deployments for convincing European populations that America would not abandon them to Soviet pressure, creating political stability necessary for economic cooperation and eventual military alliance. The human cost of maintaining operations through winter conditions included not only aircrew casualties, but psychological stress on personnel who flew multiple missions daily, while knowing that mistakes could trigger global war or result in civilian starvation in Berlin. Flight surgeons reported increasing cases of fatigue-related errors and stress reactions among air crew who had been operating at maximum intensity for over 6 months without rest periods that normal military operations would have required. Clay's personal attention to crew welfare included arranging for rest facilities and recreational activities that helped maintain morale, while his correspondence with families of deceased aircrew shows genuine personal concern for individuals whose sacrifice had made the operation's success possible. The legacy of Clay's confrontation with Stalin established principles of crisis management that influenced American foreign policy throughout the Cold War and beyond, proving that calculated risk-taking backed by technological superiority and unwavering determination could successfully deter aggression without triggering the very conflicts that such deterrence sought to prevent. Modern diplomatic historians credit the Berlin airlift with establishing credible American commitment to NATO allies and demonstrating that the United States would risk war rather than abandon democratic principles, creating the foundation for peaceful resolution of subsequent Cold War crises through recognition of American resolve. Clay's willingness to tell Stalin, "You'll have to kill me first," became a template for American negotiating positions that successfully maintained peace through strength for the next 4 decades of global competition.